Our, of course, chair of the session was Professor Konstantia, and we are welcoming her again to give us her insights into international and national mountain legislation and policies, sharing her experience in this field because she has a very rich experience in working with international laws and developments in areas of sustainable development. So please go ahead and give us your insights into.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to take 1 second here to see if I can restart my presentation, because there we go. Hopefully that will do it. Let's see. Okay, perfect. So everybody can hear me, I assume.
Yes,
my presentation today is in more, well, basically it's not nearly as exciting as what we just saw. So I was looking at the other presentations and I thought, oh man, I would love to be doing something like that rather than what I am doing, because it just sounded so much more interesting. Unfortunately, though, everything that has to do with law and policies have such an impact on mountain development and mountain communities that it's very hard to ignore. So my presentation today is based on an article by Owen Lynch and Gregory Maggio, and they are from the Center of International Environmental Law in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. And the article is called Mountain Laws and Peoples, Moving Towards Sustainable Development and Recognition of Community-Based Property Rights. So if you want to the sort of the guts of the presentation, you will find them in this article. And for me, it was the easiest way to do it, as they have made a very succinct summary of the sort of legal policy type aspects of mountain development and mountain communities. But what I'm going to do in the presentation is add my perspective to what they have done. So there is no doubt that basically mountains, a lot like forests, are areas that are completely ignored by, not completely, but very much ignored by the legal system. In international law, for instance, we have all sorts of treaties and legal instruments with regards to all sorts of other ecotype systems, whether it's oceans, deserts, et cetera, however, mountains are largely ignored, and so are forests, and often forests and mountains go together. So the so basically, what we're going to try and decipher here is figure out how to promote conservation and sustainable development through law and policy without undermining it. This is another thing that people need to understand. We often think of law and policy as something, as ways forward, as something positive. Therefore, if we have legal protection, or if we have a policy statement or a policy program designed to protect, that it's going to do just that. Well, often it does quite the opposite. So we have to sort of switch our mindset to understand that judicial frameworks and policy frameworks can be positive or they can be negative. Sorry, just a few pictures there. So what we have to do is sort of have a new paradigm as to how we're going to approach mountain systems and, system in general, but here we're going to specify mountain systems, and to take care of the needs of the people, as well as take advantage of all that amazing traditional knowledge and local knowledge that is present in mountain communities. So therefore, the new paradigm cannot be a paradigm that comes in from the outside, as it often does, and say, here's how we're going to fix your problems. It has to be a paradigm that is constructed within communities and based on community needs and community knowledge, because as we know, communities know best what their issues are, and for the most part, know what the solutions are. They just don't have the resources to put these solutions into play. So the article supports this horizontal and vertical matrix of mutual supportive law and policy relationships. And they argue that this needs to be on a local, national, regional, and international level. And although I agree with that, I would caution, like I said, in this idea that that the mutual supportive law and policy relationships are always that. Quite often they are the opposite. So though I agree this is what is needed, I would caution that even though relationships that seem supportive and mutual quite often are not, or once they are put into motion, we realize that they are not the case. So law and policy needs to be ever evolving, ever changing to adapt to the needs of the people, not necessarily changing needs, but to the idea that maybe we got it wrong to begin with. So if we sort of think of national and local communities, quite often that's where we find the most abundant type of activity when it comes to policy and law for mountain communities. And that makes sense. Like I said, on an international level, we tend to sort of ignore that aspect. However, these sort of promising initiatives need to be put in a context of the relationship between the local communities and the national government. And what do I mean by this? And this is what I'm saying about sort of providing context and my comments on the paper that was written by the two other authors. And what I mean by that is that often mountain communities in particular, I mean, communities in general, but mountain communities in particular, as we know, mountain communities tend to be, sort of filled by independent type people. And there is, this sort of tradition that you hear about clear across the world of sort of mountain people being sort of resistant to external input, resistant to this idea that someone from a national government that is in a big city somewhere, in the country, that is going to come in and sort of tell them what to do. And so we have to sort of keep that context in mind, that there is this sometimes antagonistic relationship between mountain communities and the sort of city folk that comes in and tries to tell them what to do. And that needs to be understood, because quite often there has been a lot of these sort of policies that have been put in place by people far away from mountain communities that have been a complete disaster for mountain communities. So instead of leading to economic development or cultural development, it has done the exact opposite. So this is, like I said, something to keep in mind, the sort of relationship between these different entities. The other entities that we need to sort of discuss here is people like us, sort of researchers and academics and scientists, that again, quite often go into these mountain communities with the idea of doing research, with the idea of collecting samples, with interviews and so on and so forth. And again, we have a tendency to sort of go in, take the information, go out, and then never actually go back and contribute to the communities that we took all this information and data from. And so this data needs to then go back to the communities, and it needs to be translated into language and ways of presenting that is adaptable to the local community. So they understand how the data was actually used, what was done with, and what were the outcomes, so that they are able then, one, to correct researchers, because quite often we make mistakes, but we don't think we do. I mean, researchers, scientists, academics, we tend to have a bit of an ego, and we tend to sort of assume that what we do is, perfect. But quite often what we interpret things wrong, we get things wrong. And if you don't have this sort of going back to the community and getting that feedback at the end, we will never know that we got it wrong, because obviously who wants to just assume that they are wrong? So that's, one of the issues. Another issue is that it makes communities more likely to want to participate in future scientific endeavors, so that we are able to learn more and we are able to come out with better solutions. So the idea that international actors need to deepen their understanding of the conditions and context of mountain peoples and ecosystem goes without saying. A lot of people that are involved in international governance, in international bodies, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's other type of international community, other international entities, I should say, or organizations, they tend to have very little sort of contact with mountain communities. Again, like I said, there are mountain communities that are relatively accessible, but quite often mountain communities tend to be not as accessible, and therefore they are visited less frequently. And it is not right to say that one mountain community's needs and observations and perspectives are the same as another. A ridge between a community can make all the difference as to what these communities need, and therefore to sort of just lump them all in one is not doing really anybody any favors. But that's how it tends to be done in the international arena, and that is basically also true for any ecosystem, not just mountains, whether it's oceans, island nations, so on and so forth, indigenous communities and indigenous nations. We've seen this over and over and over. We all know that indigenous peoples are and indigenous nations have their own priorities and their own perspectives and their own needs and issues, and those from one indigenous nation to another may differ greatly, but we tend to just lump everybody in. So in terms of effective legal policy strategies, the authors present a couple of ways to go forward. Address the specific ecological, economic, and cultural realities of mountain domains. Promote the well-being of the people directly dependent on mountain resources. Foster community-based strategies for mountain conservation and sustainable development, and consist of mutually reinforcing mechanisms at different levels. Again, there's nothing I disagree with here, and I think most of us would not disagree, and most of us would agree that this is what is needed. The sort of issue that I have is that we need to be a little more careful in what I just mentioned, in the sort of lumping of mountain communities into one settings. I just sort of basically drove more or less from California all the way to Florida in southern United States, and I have been through great number of mountain communities, and all these communities looked very, very different and had very, very different perspectives on the world, needs, and also, but also geographies, right? So you can have mountain communities that are basically deserts. You can have mountain communities that are basically forests. You can have mountain communities that are watersheds that have so many different wetlands and other water-based ecosystems. You can have mountain communities where there is nothing but sort of traditional economies based on rearing animals and so on and so forth, but also you can have mountain communities that are very industrialized, small but very industrialized, that are based on forestry, or is based on mining, particularly mining in the southern United States, and so on and so forth. And therefore, you cannot just simply say we need legal and policy strategies that are what is presented on the screen here. We need to actually be very focused on the different types of communities, also based on geographical differences that makes quite a bit of difference on how we go about putting policy measures forward. And so a way to look at this is sort of separating it between sort of soft and hard law, whether it's national or international, and traditional legal customs and sort of, I guess, what we would call national or modern, if you will, legal and policy frameworks. And so in terms of that, the authors talk about this whole idea of maybe looking towards a community-based management rather than a state-based management. And we can totally understand that. As I have just mentioned, and a lot of you have mentioned throughout the past week or so, there has been a sort of failure on state level to come up with a paradigm for mountain areas that are reflective of the needs and the sort of right for these people to participate in the way forward of their communities, rather than being sort of have solutions sort of imposed upon them from the outside. The idea that there should be a legal recognition of community-based property rights. Now, this is a very sort of complicated issue, and I think the authors in the article that I'm basing this on has done a decent job in sort of fleshing out some of these issues. But I would go a little bit further. Again, we have to sort of keep in mind the different priorities of different mountain communities. And so if I can speak to sort of my community, because like I said, I'm from a mountain community in Greece, and there, this whole idea of community-based property rights can be a bit controversial. And I'm going to talk about tenure systems in a minute, but, we sort of, I go to my village and I know whose property starts where by, rocks that are placed in a certain way in the middle of fields on the side of the mountain. And to me, it makes perfect sense. Like I don't need, complicated maps or sort of computer systems and this and that to tell me where it is. We just all know, because it's just the knowledge that you get passed on from generation to generation. But at the same time, there is a lot of the landscape that by default needs to be sort of open. And to a certain degree, that includes private property. Why? Because so much of the people's livelihood in that area anyway depends on herding animals, to a large degree goats. I mean, there's others, but definitely I would say a good sort of 80 to 90% is goats. And goats, you need to let them go, you need to let them roam, you need to let them, and you can't spend your entire day sitting right next to them. So you take them up on the side of a mountain, you let them go, and then you go home, you do the other 50 million things that you need to do, and then you go back and sort of try and find them. Sometimes you find them all, sometimes you don't. But this whole idea that we need to sort of have a more structured property rights system, I'm hesitant with, because we have to keep it in mind of the realities of what that all means for the type of activities that are being that take place in these different areas of the world. So in terms of international law, there is sort of these broad protections for community-based property rights, especially as it concerns Indigenous and other local communities. And for whatever reason, I guess it was, the spell check, or the thing that keeps changing all your words, autocorrect. Indigenous obviously needs to have a capital I, and anywhere where you see in my presentation Indigenous with a small I, just pretend you're seeing a capital I, because as it should be. We would never write European with a small e, so writing Indigenous with a small I is not the way to go. However, for some reason, autocorrect always changes it to a small I. And this type of recognition is obviously important. And it's important in, again, trying to sort of push back on this externally imposed policies, whether they're colonially based or from national governments or even international entities, sort of to sort of push back on that and kind of empower more communities rather than external policy and legal entities. And like I said, initially, some of the policies that were meant to create economic development, sustainable economic development, and cultural development, and increased education and so forth, has had the opposite impact, as we know, in terms of illegal extraction of resources, but also legal extraction of resources leads to the same scenario. Some other issues that need to be taken into account is this whole idea of the relationship between commercial entrepreneurs and communities in terms of extracting natural resources. Again, a lot of the external entrepreneurs tend to be, a lot of the commercial entrepreneurs tend to be external. They are not from the communities. And that is one of the issues that we find, whether it's in an Indigenous context or local community context, is that we tend to imagine economic development as something that external forces come in for a short amount of time. They provide economic development to that community. When the resource runs out, they take their stuff and leave, and the community is not left any better off than it was when they first came in. And of course, this is not something that we should be promoting. So some of the specific characteristics of mountain ecosystems relevant to law and policy. like I said, a lot of mountain communities tend to be more isolated than most other ecosystems, and that is understandable. Quite often, just transportation makes it very difficult to have them accessible. So there is, and that's a two-edged sword, right? Because the more you become accessible, the more you are, there is this possibility of having this exploitation happen. But at the same time, the less you are accessible, the harder it is to get in some of the things that would make life and development easier, such as fuel. So isolation I have talked about, and the only thing I would like to add in this slide is this idea of telecommunications. And of course, telecommunications are rather important. You know, I have an aunt in my village that is completely illiterate. She can't read, she can't write. However, she is able to communicate with, you know, this sort of I guess computer thing that her kids set up for her with, you know, our people that have left the village and are now all over Greece, or are really all over the world, myself being in Canada. And that is very, you know, important to her. So if you said to her, what's more important to you, read or write, or have access to this capacity to communicate with your friends and family that have now left the village, she would obviously pick the latter. And so that's something that we need to sort of be in the forefront of policy, because it's one thing to be isolated in terms of keeping your autonomy, keeping the power to decide the policies for your area. It's another thing not to be able to communicate with those that have left. And that's, as we saw in the presentation just previously, urbanization is something that makes it difficult for villages to keep their populations, because, you know, especially younger people tend to move away. And transparent relocation, you know, the idea that basically mountain ranges don't obey laws per se, just like oceans and winds don't obey laws. So a lot of communities sort of find themselves arbitrarily placed in jurisdictions that either divide them in one way or another, but the whole thing is more or less artificial, because that's not how they would have want things to be, because they are one community, irrespective of what the legal implications is in terms of territory. Diversity of livelihood and strategies. I think I've more or less discussed this, but I would like to add a little bit on agriculture, which is one of my sort of main interests as well. And agriculture in mountain communities tends to be obviously quite different than agriculture in a valley or in a prairie. And therefore, you know, we need to sort of think about smart agriculture for these communities in the sense that does not include big machinery and a lot of sort of electronic type of equipment. We need to think about it with the geography in place at the time and the particular soils that are present in a lot of mountain communities. And of course, this I already talked about, so I'm just going to move right through, is cultural diversity. One ridge from one side to the mountain to the other side of the mountain can have tremendous implications for language, tremendous implication for culture, and so on and forth. And languages and policies need to take this into consideration. As if I'm sure you probably heard, you know, like in Greece and in Turkey and in other places, there's, you know, languages in the mountains that are based on whistling alone, because whistling you could hear it carries in a mountain, whereas words don't necessarily do. So therefore, the protection of these unique cultural aspects need to be taken into consideration. And of course, there is environmental aspects of various mountain communities that are more sensitive to exploitations than others. And of course, we need to keep that in mind. For instance, some of the mountain communities I passed through that are more desert-like tend to be a lot more sensitive to climatic changes and to economic development changes than some of the more robust forest communities.
Professor Konstantia,
Yes.
we almost run out of time, so you have 1 minute to wrap it up, please.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. And so, like I said, and another reason to base this on an existing paper. So if you sort of want to know more of the details on this, so some of the I have in the end here somewhere more of the sort of national laws and stuff, all that you can find in the paper. So this is sort of the part of the presentation that I'm not really adding anything special than what is already in the paper. So you can find that. But to sort of resume, and it is more or less the first part of the presentation that was important to me, and that is that law and policy with regards to mountain communities and mountain ecosystems need to take into consideration those specificities of those areas, of those communities. And we have not done so far at all, one. And two, in terms of whether that is the approach that we really need in terms of having sort of these global approaches, I'm not sure that's the way to do it. And I really feel that we need to have these very community specific, ecosystem specific type policies and legal frameworks to help those areas to protect themselves. So instead of thinking of law and policy as something that is broad, that we can just sort of generally say, well, now today we're going to have an international sort of convention on the rights and protection of mountain areas, that we've seen with the oceans, we've seen with deserts, we've seen with other ecosystems. We haven't really gotten that far, right? The oceans are not that much better off now than they were when we put in all the international ocean laws, decades ago. So I think we need to think of policy and law more like, what is it that we can put in place that comes internally from communities, respecting the specificities of an ecosystem to help them protect themselves, rather than have a broad sweeping legislation that pretends that they are in fact considering the specificities of different communities when in fact they are not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Konstantia. It's very enlightening, and well, thank you for also presenting us with those challenges that local communities, mountain communities, and ecosystem face in terms of legislation and policies. I agree with you that with the point you raised, that those legislations should come from within communities, because they're not only because they know better about their needs and wants and problems, but also because they are more likely to adhere and follow those regulations. And of course, a community-based solution will be more sustainable and likely to transform people's livelihood and also add to the global sustainable development that we want to achieve. Thank you. And I think we move, thank you all presenters for very good and inspiring presentations. And now we will move to our next